In this video presentation, I'm going to discuss the laws that were enacted after the stock market crash in 1929 and how they are used in the underwriting process. And there's really three parts of the process. I'm going to put all three down here, but I put some of this information up here already because of the time constraints. So I'm going to read some of this really quick. Well, the two acts were the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Here in red is just some other names that you might see the Securities Act of 1933 referred to as. So AKA the Paper Act, the Full Disclosure Act, the New Issues Act, the Truth and Securities Act, and the Prospectus Act. And a few other things that was important with the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934 was it created the Securities and Exchange Commission, also known as the SEC. It was amended in 1938 and was called the Maloney Act. It's called the Maloney Act. What it did was it gave smaller bodies some more policing or regulating, such as some people refer to the FINRA or the CBOE. I'll put a few other boards here. So here in blue, light blue and dark blue, is kind of an overview, just a general. Basically, the Securities and Exchange Act looked at new issues, made sure that people were making informed decisions with new issues. It required new issues to register with the Securities and Exchange Commission, a prospectus, something we refer to today as a 10K. It also attempted to prevent any future fraud in underwriting new securities. Now over here, this is a little bit more where the securities is not brand new, but it's now on the markets trading. So the Securities Exchange Commission looks at the trading of securities, people involved in trading securities, and the fraudulent practices you might see in trading. Overview, just in this here, it got to some more specifics that both these laws look at. It requires full disclosure of any new issue that will go interstate. It requires all material that is available to be available to investors, new investors. We have to be able to digest everything so that when we purchase these companies, because we are becoming owners of the company. It also looked at the regulation, underwriting, both primary and secondary underwriting and distribution of primary and secondary. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the three parts. I'm going to say part one down here, part one of the underwriting process, because this is a big part of it. So we now have the laws. Let's look at one. The part one, I'll call it the first thing that has to be done when a company is going to be underwriting or becoming a publicly traded company, is we need a registration. I put an extra R there. Registration. The registration statement. What happens here is the issuer is the company, will file with the SEC. They'll file a registration statement, and part of the registration statement is referred to as the prospectus. That's part of it. It's called the prospectus. So you can kind of see the Prospectus Act here. And everybody involved will be able to get this. Well, I mean, all the people that are going to purchase this, including the issuers, the underwriters. And basically what you see here is you have this as a description of the company. You're also going to have all the people involved in the company, the management. Basically, they're going to give a 5-year history of each of them. 5 years history of each of the people. It'll look at the capital structure. Of course, we call that liability plus equity, but it's going to look at how much each one of these are and the structure of it. It's also going to look at, okay, once this company is sold and purchased by other people, what are we going to do with all this new money? We're going to talk about that. If there's any legal proceedings on the company, got to know if there's legal proceedings. It's also going to be proceedings. It's also going to be signed. It's going to be signed by many people. It's going to be signed by the CEO of the firm, the CFO of the firm, the lead accountant will sign it. A lot of people on the board will sign it. And this is part one. I'll put a line here for part two. Part two is sometimes referred to as the cooling off period. So the cooling off. Oops, got an extra little off. There we go. Period. Now the cooling off period could last 20 days. That's the minimum. never usually does because it usually lasts longer, but 20 is the minimum days, because when it's over, Part 3 becomes the effective date. That's what it's called, the Part 3. I'm going to call it, put it over here for the effective date, and that's at the end of the cooling effective date period. Minimum of 20 days. What happens during this period is kind of interesting. This is when we see if there's any interest in the business, somebody buying it. We cannot do any selling here. We can advertise and take orders, but the advertising here, the only advertising we can do is called tombstone advertising. I'll just put AV advertising. Pull this down a minute. I need a little more space here. Advertising. And what we're using here, because what happens is now the prospectus is called the preliminary prospectus, or also sometimes it's referred to as the red herring. I do that in red. The red herring. Well, go back to this tombstone. The tombstone advertising looks at gross proceedings. Gross. It doesn't look at gross and net. That will usually be over here. It's just gross. There is no price, so I'm going to put no price is given here. We have no price, cannot have a price, and we have no effective date. Even though the effective date's here, we can say that it's in 20 days, but we can't give the effective date of when it's going to be in the red herring because we don't really know. Pull this down just a little bit more. During this period of time, if the SEC has an issue with this, they can do something called a stop order and stop this whole thing from occurring. Stop order. Finally, at the end of the period, before they have this effective date, they may have a meeting called the due diligence, or the diligent meeting. The due diligent meeting. Due diligent. Can't write. Due diligent meeting. And the due diligent, oh, there's an I there, it's a C. And the due diligent meaning they'll look at certain things. They'll look at, examine what's happened, examine any kind of financial risk or just risk in general, financial analysis, things of that will happen. If the meeting goes okay, then we'll have the effective date. The effective date, what happens here, the red herring is amended to become the final prospectus. So we amended it to now to be the final, and now we can take some orders. Take orders for the sale of the company. And this is where we'll have the price of the company. We'll have the history of the company, the description of the company, management structure. Again, legal proceedings. There's also going to be an SEC disclaimer here. Very important, this SEC disclaimer, whether or not the company can be sold. Now, certain offerings, the prospectus delivery requirement, there is a prospectus delivery requirement period, or a number of days, which is security. A number of days depends upon, I'm sorry, let me take that back. In certain offerings, there's going to be required a prospectus delivery requirement period. It depends on the exchange that it's going to be listed on, how many days that might be, whether it's listed on the NASDAQ or the a non-NASDAQ exchange. But that is some of the laws and some of the parts of underwriting a new issue.